PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, 4 letters that carry a lot of weight for veterans. Some of you are hearing this and know exactly what I'm talking about because you are living it. Some of you suspect you have it, but don't yet want to admit it. And some of you are trying to figure out how the hell the VA even rates it. Listen, I'm Dr. Marshall Bahr, physician and former Army Ranger with multiple combat tours under my belt, and I have combat PTSD myself. I've treated PTSD as a physician, I've lived with it as a veteran, and I've navigated the VA rating system for it. Today, I'm breaking down everything about PTSD ratings, what PTSD actually is from a clinical perspective, how the VA diagnoses it using the DSM-5 criteria, how they rate it from 0% to 100%, what to expect at your C&P exam, and what to do if your PTSD is so severe you can no longer work. This is the complete guide to PTSD ratings from someone who's been on both sides of the clipboard. So let's get into it. So what is PTSD and what is the history of it? Well, PTSD is not new. We've just called it a different name throughout history. Listen, in World War I, they called it shell shock. In World War II, it was combat fatigue or battle neurosis. In the Vietnam era, it was post-Vietnam syndrome. But the symptoms were always the same: intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, avoidance behaviors. The difference now is that we understand it's a legitimate psychiatric condition with neurobiological changes in the brain, not weakness or cowardice or a lack of character, though good luck explaining that to anyone who hasn't experienced it yet. So when did PTSD become a diagnosable condition? Well, it was officially recognized in 1980 when it was added to the DSM-3, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Mental Health Disorders, 3rd edition. That was largely thanks to Vietnam veterans and mental health professionals who pushed for recognition of combat trauma as a legitimate disorder. Before that, you were expected to suck it up and just move on, which, spoiler alert, doesn't actually work for trauma-related psychiatric conditions. So what is the DSM-5? Well, it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, and it was the 5th edition. It's essentially the Bible of psychiatric diagnoses. When a mental health provider evaluates for you for PTSD, they are using this DSM-5 criteria to determine if you meet the diagnostic threshold. The VA uses these same criteria, so understanding the DSM-5 is crucial for understanding how PTSD is diagnosed and therefore how it gets rated for VA purposes. So what is the PTSD criteria in the DSM-5? Well, the DSM-5 has 8 criteria for PTSD, labeled A through H. You have to meet all of them to be diagnosed with PTSD, not just some. Think of it like building a Jenga tower. You need all the blocks in place for the structure to stand. So let me walk you through each one. So PTSD criteria A is the stressor. So criterion A is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. This is the traumatic stressor that causes PTSD. For military PTSD, this is usually combat exposures. Think firefights, IED attacks, rocket attacks, seeing casualties, whatever traumatic events you experienced during your deployment. But it can also be military sexual trauma, training accidents, or other traumatic events during service or stateside. The key is you have to have been exposed to the trauma in one of 4 ways. You directly experienced it, you witnessed it happening to others, you learned it happening to a close family member or friend, or you were repeatedly exposed to aversive details of the traumatic events, like EOD guys dealing with IEDs constantly, or combat medics treating casualties repeatedly. For me, as a Ranger, criteria A was met through multiple combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, firefights, IED blasts, casualties, all the stuff you sign up for when you join the regiment, but that doesn't make it any less traumatic when it happens. So here are some non-military examples of PTSD. So remember, PTSD is not just a military thing. Civilians can also develop PTSD from, say, car accidents, natural disasters, violent crimes, sexual assault, any traumatic event that meets criteria A. The difference with combat PTSD is the repeated exposure and the intensity of the stressors. So a civilian might have PTSD from one car accident. A combat veteran might have PTSD from hundreds of hours of combat operations over multiple deployments. The diagnosis is the same, but the complexity and the severity will often differ. For VA purposes, you need to establish that your PTSD is service-connected, that the traumatic stressor happened during your military service. That's your criteria A for VA claims. Without that connection to service, you won't get service-connected for PTSD, even if you clearly have it. So let's go into a detailed discussion of the second criteria, criteria B, which is intrusive symptoms. So this is where the trauma keeps invading your mind, even when you don't want to think about it. You need at least one of these following symptoms. First, recurrent intrusive memories, like you're sitting at home and suddenly you're back in that firefight. The memories come unbidden. You can't control when they show up. For me, it's sensory triggers. The smell of diesel fuel, the sound of helicopters, the sound of crying women and children, certain heat and humidity combinations that feel like Iraq, and boom, instantly, I'm a flashback to 2008. Second, recurrent nightmares about the trauma. So you're asleep and you're reliving it. You wake up in cold sweats. Your spouse tells you you were yelling in your sleep. This is probably the most common PTSD symptom I see in veterans. The nightmares are vivid, terrifying, and often exactly what happened or variations of the traumatic events that happened to them. Third, dissociative reactions like flashbacks, where you feel like the traumatic event is actually happening again in real time. This is where it's the most severe thing the most severe form of intrusive memories. You're not just remembering it, you're actually mentally transported back to that event. You lose awareness of your current surroundings. Some guys dive for cover when they hear fireworks. That is a flashback. Fourth one is intense psychological distress when exposed to cues that remind you of the traumatic event. So these are like anniversary reactions. So watching war movies, hearing news about the conflicts you deploy to, these triggers cause significant anxiety or distress. Now, fifth is marked psychological reactions to reminders of the trauma. Like your heart starts to race, you start sweating, your breathing gets really rapid. It's your body responding to perceived threats, even though you're very safe at that moment. This is your amygdala firing off before your prefrontal cortex can tell you to actually calm down. Most combat veterans with PTSD have multiple criteria B symptoms, not just one. You've got the nightmares and the intrusive memories and the psychological reactions. It's a package deal, unfortunately. Now, the third criteria is criteria C, and that is avoidance. You need at least one of these following, all right? So first would be either avoidance of distressing memories, like thoughts or feelings of the traumatic event. You don't want to think about it, talk about it, or remember it. So you push it down, you bury it, you distract yourself. You refuse to engage with anything that might bring up those memories. Second is avoidance of external reminders of the trauma. You won't watch war movies. You avoid crowds because they remind you of threat environments. You won't go to 4th of July celebrations because fireworks sound like gunfire. You've reorganized your life around your ability to avoid these triggers. I see this constantly in veterans. They've built their entire lives and their entire civilian lives around avoidance without even realizing it. They've isolated themselves because being around people is too triggering. They've given up activities they used to enjoy because they are connected to memories of service or deployment. So what about the fourth one, criteria D? It is negative changes in thoughts and mood. This is the cognitive and emotional component of PTSD. You need at least two of these 7 symptoms I'm about to describe. First symptom, inability to remember important aspects of the traumatic event. This isn't regular forgetting, it's dissociative amnesia, where your brain actually has to block out parts of the traumatic event. Some guys can't remember specific firefights or details about traumatic events they were involved in. Their brain has protected them by making those memories inaccessible. Second, persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs about yourself, others, or the world. This is things like thinking I'm damaged, nobody can be trusted, the world is completely dangerous. These are the cognitive distortions that develop after traumatic events. You overgeneralize from your traumatic experience to all of your life. Third symptom is persistent distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the trauma that lead to blame. So either you blame yourself, like I should have done more, or I should have prevented it, or you inappropriately blame others. That's what we call survivor's guilt, right? Why did I make it when they didn't? The fourth symptom, persistent negative emotional state. This is a chronic anger, fear, horror, shame, or guilt state. You're stuck in these negative emotions. They've become your new baseline. For me and many combat veterans, anger is the dominant one. Easily being irritable. Everything pisses you off and you're constantly on edge. Fifth symptom, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. Like you don't care about things you used to. Hobbies don't interest you anymore. Social events feel pointless. You have withdrawn from life because nothing feels meaningful anymore. Sixth symptom, feeling detached or estranged from others. You feel disconnected from people. Even your own family feels distant. You can't relate to civilians anymore because they don't understand. You can't fully connect with other veterans because you don't want to talk about it. You've isolated yourself even when you're surrounded by people. Now, the seventh symptom is persistent inability to experience positive emotions. This is emotional numbing. You can't feel happiness anymore. You can't feel satisfaction, love. You feel nothing, or you only feel negative emotions. Life is just flat and gray to you. This is one of the most insidious symptoms because you lose the ability to experience joy. Criteria D is where PTSD really destroys your quality of life. The intrusive symptoms are distressing, but the negative cognition and mood changes are what make you unable to function in relationships, work, and even life. What about the fifth criteria? It is criteria E, and it is changes in arousal and reactivity. This is your nervous system being stuck in that threat mode. You need at least 2 of these 6 symptoms I'm about to describe. First symptom, irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation. You snap at people, road rage, disproportionate anger at minor frustrations. Your family walks on eggshells around you because they don't know what will set you off. Second symptom is reckless or even self-destructive behavior. So driving too fast, substance abuse or alcoholism, taking unnecessary risk. Part of you doesn't care if something bad happens, but part of you is seeking the adrenaline you got from combat. It's called trauma candy. Third symptom is hypervigilance. You're constantly scanning for threats. You sit facing the door in restaurants. You can't relax in public places. You're always assessing who might be a threat and planning your exit routes in real time. This is absolutely exhausting, but you can't turn it off. The fourth symptom is exaggerated startle response. Loud noises make you jump or duck. Someone walks up behind you and you spin around to fight them. Your nervous system is set to maximum sensitivity and overreacts to stimuli that wouldn't bother most people. The fifth symptom is problems with your concentration. You cannot focus on tasks. Your mind wanders to those traumatic memories, those intrusive memories. You start projects, but you can't finish them. This affects your work, your school, everything that requires a sustained attention level. What about the sixth criteria? Well, it's criteria F, and it is duration. The symptoms in criteria B, C, D, and E must last for more than 1 month. This distinguishes PTSD from acute stress disorder, which is when you have these symptoms immediately after trauma, but they resolve within a month. If symptoms persist beyond that 1 month time frame, that's when we call it PTSD. For most combat veterans seeking VA disability, the criteria is easily met. You've been dealing with symptoms for years, typically, and not just weeks. Now, the next criteria is criteria G, and it's about functional significance. The disturbances must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. In other words, your PTSD symptoms have to actually be affecting your life. If you have all these symptoms, but somehow they're not causing problems in your relationships, your work, or daily functioning, it's not diagnosable PTSD. For VA purposes, this is crucial. The VA wants to know how your PTSD affects your ability to work, maintain relationships, and function in your daily life. This functional impairment is what determines your rating percentage. The next criteria is the H criteria, and it is exclusion. That means the symptoms that you have cannot be attributable to either substance use, medication, or another medical condition. And this is where it gets a little muddied and complicated because many veterans with PTSD also have substance use problems. They're self-medicating the PTSD symptoms with either alcohol or drugs. And the question really has to be, are your symptoms from PTSD or from substance use? The clinical assessment is whether you had PTSD symptoms before the substance use started, or if the symptoms persist when you're not using substances. Usually with combat veterans, the PTSD came first and the substance use developed as a coping mechanism. That's still PTSD, not substance-induced disorder. But if your symptoms are only present when you're using substances and resolve when you're sober, that is substance-induced disorder and not PTSD. The VA will want to see that your symptoms exist independent of substance use. That is why I tell veterans, if you're self-medicating your PTSD with either alcohol or drugs, you need to get into treatment, not just for your health, but because ongoing substance abuse can complicate your PTSD claim and rating. The VA might argue your symptoms are substance-related rather than PTSD. So are there any PTSD exceptions when it comes to VA disability claims? Well, for VA claims, there are some regulatory provisions that make PTSD easier to establish than other mental health conditions. Say if you have a PTSD diagnosis and you were engaged in combat, the VA is supposed to accept your lay testimony about combat stressors without requiring corroboration. So your credible statement about what happened in combat is sufficient evidence of the stressor. This is huge because many combat events are not documented in official records. The firefight that gave you PTSD might not be in any unit logs, but if you have a combat infantry badge or other evidence you were in combat, your testimony about specific stressors is supposed to be accepted. So what are PTSD specifications? Well, the DSM-5 has two important specifications for PTSD, like dissociative specification and delayed specification. So dissociative specification means you have PTSD with prominent dissociative symptoms, meaning either depersonalization or derealization. Now these are big words, so let me explain. Depersonalization is feeling detached from yourself, like you're observing yourself in third-person video game from outside your body. Derealization is feeling the world around you is unreal, dreamlike, or even distorted. These are severe PTSD symptoms that indicate more complex trauma. From a VA rating perspective, dissociative PTSD typically rates higher because the functional impairment is way more severe. Now, what about delayed specification? Well, that means your PTSD symptoms didn't meet full criteria until at least 6 months after the traumatic events. This is what happened to me. So maybe you had some symptoms immediately, but the full syndrome didn't develop until much later on. This is relevant for VA claims because some veterans don't develop full PTSD symptoms until years after they separate from the military. Maybe you held it together while you were in and everything fell apart once you got out. That's delayed onset PTSD, and it's still service-connected as long as you can link it to service-connected stressors. So the real question here is, how does the VA rate PTSD? Well, the VA rates PTSD under diagnostic code 9411 in the mental health disorder section. There are 5 possible ratings: 0%, 30%, 50%, 7%, and 100%. The rating is based on the severity of symptoms and the level of occupational and social impairment. So what is a 0% rating? It means you have a diagnosis of PTSD, but your symptoms are not severe enough to cause occupational or social impairment. Essentially, you meet diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but you're still functioning normally at work and you're in relationships. This is rare, but it does exist. Now, 30% is for occupational and social impairment with occasional decreases in your work efficiency and intermittent periods of inability to perform occupational tasks. But you're still generally functioning satisfactorily with routine behavior and self-care. So that's a mouthful. In plain English, your PTSD causes some problems at work and in relationships, but you're mostly holding it together. You have bad days, but they're intermittent, not constant. This is the rating for mild to moderate PTSD that's causing some functional impairment, but not severe disruption yet. Now, 50% is for occupational and social impairment with reduced reliability and productivity. This includes symptoms like difficulty understanding complex commands, impairment of short and long-term memory, impaired judgment, impaired abstract thinking, disturbances of motivation and mood, difficulty maintaining and establishing effective relationships. This is moderate to severe PTSD that's significantly affecting your work performance and your relationships. You can still work, but your reliability and your productivity are significantly reduced, and your relationships are now feeling very strained. Now, what about 70% PTSD rating? Well, this is for occupational and social impairment with deficiencies in most areas, such as work, school, family relations, judgment, thinking, or mood. Specific symptoms might include things like suicidal ideation, obsessional rituals that interfere with routine activities, speech that is intermittently illogical or obscure, near continuous panic or depression, impaired impulse control, spatial disorientation, neglect of personal appearance and hygiene, difficulty adapting to stressful circumstances. This is severe PTSD that's causing major dysfunction in most of your life areas. You might still be working, but barely holding on. Your relationships are severely impaired. You're having severe symptoms like suicidal thoughts, severe depression, or panic attacks. This is the most common rating for combat veterans with significant PTSD. Now, what's the last one? The last bucket is 100%, and this is for total occupational and social impairment due to symptoms such as gross impairment in thought processes or communication, persistent delusions or hallucinations, grossly inappropriate behavior, persistent danger of hurting yourself or even others, intermittent ability to perform activities of even your daily living like brushing your teeth, bathing, going to the bathroom, disorientation to time or place, memory loss for names of close relatives or your own occupation, or inability to obtain and retain employment. This is the most severe form of PTSD. You cannot work. You cannot maintain relationships. You may need assistance with even basic activities of daily living. This is the veteran who's completely unable to function due to PTSD. Or it's the rating for TDIU, which is unemployability, where your PTSD prevents you from maintaining substantially gainful employment, even if you're not completely unable to function. Now I want to get into some PTSD CMP exam tips. The PTSD CMP exam is where your rating gets determined. Here's how to approach it from someone who's been through it and who's reviewed hundreds of these exams as a physician too. First, this is important. Be honest. Do not exaggerate, but definitely do not minimize. Veterans tend to downplay symptoms because they're conditioned to tough it out. This is not the time for that. If you have nightmares 5 times a week, say 5 times a week, not sometimes. Second, describe your worst symptoms, not your best days. The examiner needs to understand how bad it gets, not how well you're coping on good days. Talk about the days you can't get out of bed, the times you've had panic attacks, the fights with your spouse, the times you've called in sick to work because your PTSD was just too overwhelming. Third, bring documentation. Bring a list of your symptoms, your medications, your treatment history. The examiner might not have all your records. Make it easy for them to understand the entire picture. Fourth, explain functional impairment. Don't just list symptoms. Explain how those symptoms affect your life. I have nightmares is less impactful than I have nightmares 5 times a week, which means I average 4 hours of sleep a night, which means I'm exhausted at work and I've been written up twice for falling asleep during meetings. It means a lot more. Fifth, be prepared to discuss your trauma in detail. I know this one really sucks. Talking about traumatic events is re-traumatizing, but the examiner needs to understand your stressors and how they're affecting you. You don't have to go into every graphic, gory detail, but you do need to be specific enough that they understand what you experienced. Sixth recommendation, don't go to the exam drunk or high. I have had veterans show up to CMP exams intoxicated because they needed substances to cope with discussing their trauma. That's understandable, but it undermines your claim. The examiner will note substance use and might attribute your symptoms to that rather than your PTSD. If you need support, bring a friend or spouse who can wait outside the room, but do not self-medicate before the exam. Seventh recommendation, if you have suicidal ideation, meaning you are thinking about harming yourself, you need to tell them. I know there's a fear that if you admit to suicidal thoughts, they're going to hospitalize you or take away your guns. In most cases, that's not what happens unless you're actively planning suicide at that exact moment. But the examiner needs to know if you've ever had suicidal thoughts because that's a criteria for 70% to 100% rating. Be honest about it. Well, what if you can't work because of your PTSD? Well, then you start looking at individual unemployability or TDIU, which is VA unemployability. If your PTSD is so severe that you can no longer maintain substantially gainful employment, you may qualify for TDIU, which is total disability based on individual unemployability. TDIU actually pays you at the 100% rate, even if your scheduled rating is lower, like typically 70% for a single condition or 70% combined with at least one condition at 40%. The key is proving you cannot work because of your service-connected condition. So for PTSD, this can be common. Your PTSD might rate at 70% based on symptoms, but if those symptoms prevent you from maintaining employment, you can't handle workplace issues, maybe you have frequent panic attacks, you can't work with others due to anger or paranoia, you can't maintain schedule due to insomnia. With these, you qualify for TDIU. Now, to file for TDIU, you have to submit VA Form 21-8940. You need medical evidence showing your PTSD prevents you from working, like statements from employers about why you were fired or why you quit, documentation of multiple failed job attempts, anything showing your PTSD makes employment impossible. TDIU is not just for veterans who are completely unable to function, it's for veterans who cannot maintain substantially gainful employment. Big difference. You might be able to take care of yourself, manage your daily life, but the work environment is impossible due to your PTSD. That qualifies you for TDIU. So that's the complete guide to PTSD ratings, from the DSM-5 criteria to how the VA rates it and what to expect at your C&P exam. If you have PTSD from your military service, you deserve compensation for it. Don't let the complexity of the rating system or fear of the C&P exam stop you from filing. If you need help with your PTSD claim, especially if you need help documenting the stressor, gathering evidence, or preparing for the C&P exam, check out Xterra Health. We specialize in PTSD claims. We understand the process. There is no upfront fees. So if you're interested, the link is in the description. So hit that subscribe button for more content about VA disability from someone who's lived it and studied it. Comment below with questions. I read everything and I'll answer what I can. Remember, I'm Dr. Marshall Bahr, Ranger, physician, and combat veteran with PTSD, just like many of you. We are in this together, so don't suffer in silence. Don't leave benefits on the table. File your claim. Get the help you need. Get the compensation you deserve. Now go take care of yourself. And until next time, stay mission ready.